So we can divide total costs into fixed and variable costs. The cost of the fixed inputs in our example, machinery, is called the fixed costs. For example, it's the price of the machinery multiplied by the number of machines that have been previously purchased. Now, this cost doesn't change as output changes. Why? Because even if we increase the amount of output, the price of the machinery is not changing, and the number of machines is not changing. The cost of the variable inputs is called, creatively, variable costs. In our example, the variable input is labour. So, if you wanted, you could think of, in this example at least, variable costs means labour costs, and the total labour costs in particular. So this would be the wage rate times the number of units of labour employed. The number of units of labour employed is usually measured in terms of hours rather than in terms of people. But sometimes your textbook will refer to labour as the number of people employed. In any case, this variable cost is variable because it increases as more labour is employed to produce more output. So this cost varies with output. And finally, we've got total cost. This is simply the total fixed cost plus the total variable cost. So the capital cost plus the labour cost in our example. And this obviously goes up as more labour is employed to produce more output. Let's look at a table to see the kind of pattern of costs that emerges. Now, the reason why there's going to be a certain kind of pattern to costs here, and remember here we're talking about the short run, and we must be talking about the short run because, as we now know, the short run is when there is at least one fixed input. In this case, it's capital. So we have fixed costs and variable costs, indicating we must be operating in the short run. So if we look there, we can see we could conceivably increase the amount of output. Our firm could increase the amount of output, but in order to do so, it will have to employ more and more labour, measured in hours, to do so. And if we look carefully, we can see there's a kind of pattern to the amount of labour employed. In particular, there's a law which governs the amount of labour employed. The law is this. It's called the law of diminishing marginal returns to a variable input. Sometimes it's shortened to just the law of diminishing marginal returns. And it's a law that only applies in the short run. When we're adding more of a variable input, labour, to a fixed input, machinery. And the law states that at some point, each additional unit of labour will contribute ever less to the total output compared to previous units of labour. What that law implies for our table here is the following. At some point, at some level of output, each additional unit of output produced will require ever more additional labour to produce it. So, to see that in operation, let's go down the table. We can see to go from 0 output to 1 unit of output, the firm will be required to employ 136 hours of labour. To go from the first unit to the second unit, to produce an additional unit on top of that, we're going to have to employ an additional 110 units of labour, going from 136 units to 246 units. Let's look a bit further down. To produce an additional unit of labour an additional unit of output going from the 5th to the 6th unit of output, we'll have to employ more labour, of course, but it's an additional 58 units of labour, less than before. What about to produce the 7th unit of output? We'll have to employ an additional 56 hours of labour. To produce the 8th unit of output, we'll need an additional 61 hours of labour. Okay, from this point on, we can see there's going to be a pattern. We're going to see the law in operation. To go from the 9th to the 10th unit of output, that is, to produce the 10th unit of output, we'll need an additional 82 hours of labour. To go from the 13th to the 14th, we'll need an additional 182 units of labour. So we can see from the 7th unit of output onwards, we will need ever more additional labour to keep output going up by 1. Okay? And we can see that that is going to have an impact on our total variable costs, or our total labour costs. Because if in order to produce an additional unit of output each time, we have to employ more and more and more and more additional labour, which all have to be paid, we can see that the total variable cost is going to get larger and larger and larger at a faster rate. So let's calculate our total variable cost. That's going to be the amount of labour employed at some amount of output times the wage, which in our case we've made it $3 per hour. So if we calculate that, we get these numbers here. So this is our total variable costs. So to produce the first unit, the labour costs will be $407. To produce 5 units of output, the labour costs will be $1,425. To produce the 11th unit to produce 11 units of output, we'll need to spend $2,699 on labour. What about the total fixed costs? Well, we know that that's fixed, so that's pretty easy, and we're going to fix that at, say, $500. So at every unit of output, at every output level, it's still $500, which is paid from the very start. So the amount of the machinery and the equipment, the machinery in the factory or whatever, has been paid for at the very beginning. So whether the firm produces nothing, it's still paid $500 for the capital. If it produces 5 units, it's still already paid the $500 in capital for the machinery and equipment and so on. What about the total cost? Well, the total cost is just the total variable cost plus the total fixed cost. So we just add up at each level of output, add total fixed cost plus the total variable cost. So at the case of 0 output, there's still total costs of $500, even though the wage cost or the total variable cost is 0. We've employed no workers. So we simply add up total fixed plus total variable to get the overall total cost at each level of output. So we can see at each level of output, total costs is rising. And the reason why it's rising is not because of the fixed costs, they're fixed. It's rising because the total variable costs are rising. And what we'll see, if we look at it on a graph, we can see it much more clearly, that the total variable costs after the 7th unit of output will be rising at a faster and faster rate. And therefore, the total costs will be rising at a faster and faster rate as well. So let's look at the graph and we'll be able to see that clearly. First, we'll put in the total fixed costs. Total fixed costs were 500, no matter how much is produced. So there's our total fixed cost curve. It's always 500, no matter how much is produced. Now let's put in the total variable cost curve. So we got this snazzy looking curve here. It's always rising, that is, in order to produce more output, the firm had to employ more labour and had to pay for that labour. So the total variable cost, the total labour costs are going up. The interesting thing about that's obvious. The interesting thing about it is that the total cost, the rate at which the total variable costs rise. So initially they rise slowly, and then at around about here, that is, at the 7th unit of output, they rise faster and faster and faster and faster. Anyway, we need to put in our total costs. Total costs are total fixed costs plus the total variable cost. The machine costs plus the labour costs. So if we take at any level of output, this is just samples, say at the 6th unit of output, we take our total fixed costs and add it on top of the total variable cost. And voila! If we did that at every level of output, I've just put samples here, if we did that at every level of output, we'd have a total cost curve that is sloped upwards like this, that, if you like, it runs parallel to the total variable cost curve. It's rising too. Why is it rising? Because the component of it that's rising is the total variable costs. We've simply added to this total variable cost a fixed amount on top. So voila, we've got our total cost curves. Total cost, total variable cost, total fixed cost. And I said that the slightly interesting thing about this was after the 7th unit of output, that is, after the point at which the law of diminishing marginal returns to a variable input comes into play, we can see that the total variable costs, and thus the total cost curve, will go up at an increasing rate, because the firm has to employ ever greater quantities of additional workers. So that's that for the total costs.